Darwin, and us. In this lecture, we'll review the last lecture. We'll take a look at the Victorian world and the relentless change brought about by population growth, colonization, and industrial takeoff. We'll take a closer look at Darwin. We'll do a quick survey of Chapter 5. We'll pause on electricity for a moment, and then we'll look ahead to the next week. As I said in the last lecture, the Industrial Revolution is the beginning of rapid change in the landscape and in lifestyles. The use of powerful and mobile energy sources magnified the effects of unintended consequences. This quote is from David Landis, The Unbound Prometheus, Technological Change and Industrial Development in Western Europe from 1750 to the Present, and it's a massive tome of a book. But this quote really stood out to me. The Englishman of 1750 was closer in material things to Caesar's legionnaires than to his own great-grandchildren. That's an important and significant change that happened during this time period. So I want you to keep this in mind. We surveyed some of the changes that steam, coal, electricity, oil, gas, nuclear, and solar power made in the last 300 years. Those are changes that are dramatic and in some ways undoable. Now, carrying capacity is a term you should know, and also the concept of unintended consequences and social responsibility for unintended consequences is also something you should think about. I'm going to start the look at the Victorian world by looking at a poem from the very beginning of this period. It's from William Wordsworth, the great Romantic poet, and he wrote this poem about London. Earth has not anything to show more fair. Dull would he be of soul who could pass by a sight so touching in its majesty. This city now doth like a garment wear the beauty of the morning, silent, bare. Ships, towers, domes, theaters, and temples lie open unto the fields and to the sky, all bright and glittering in the smokeless air. Never did sun more beautifully steep in his first splendor valley, rock, or hill. Never saw I, never felt a calm so deep. The river glideth at his own sweet will. Dear God, the very houses seem asleep, and all that mighty heart is lying still. This is kind of a love letter to the city of London. And now a poem from the other end of the period. This is from May of 1915. It's by John McCrae, a Canadian Army officer and a doctor, and it was penned in Flanders Fields. It's a poem about the end of World War I. In Flanders Fields the poppies blow between the crosses, row on row that mark our place. And in the sky the larks, still bravely singing, fly, scarce heard, amid the guns below. We are the dead. Short days ago we lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders Fields. Take up our quarrel with a foe, to you from failing hands we throw the torch. Be yours to hold it high. If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders Fields. By the end of World War I, there was a rising tide of doubt and discouragement over the great Enlightenment project of human rights. I wanted to frame this week's lecture with poetry because in this century the newly named science, as a branch of learning and biology in particular, will take the place of religion and the arts to ask, who are we? What are we? What is our place in the universe? The great storm of debate about who gets to ask and answer this question is really still with us. So, science is one of the stories of science is cities, and one of the stories of science is the problem of solving through trial and error. And one of the central problems that science is always solving is, who are we? So this image shows the building of London's great sewers. It's still working perfectly today. They were built in response to repeated outbreaks of cholera and the foul odors coming from the Thames. In this period, we look at the second half of the Industrial Revolution, steel and coal, railways and communication. We also look at British imperialism and the colonial expansion, and Queen Victoria. This is the age of sailing and the creation of a biological scientific community that was both professional and philosophically divorced from the church. London is the city of the era, the hub of all that's going on. London was bursting with energy, insanely self-confident, iron-willed, workaholic, colonial and dominant. In 2016, I was in London with my parents, and I went out by myself for a run in Kensington Park. Kensington Park is in the center of the city, and in the middle of that park, I came upon this strange church-looking structure. And as I jogged up to it, I saw to my surprise that a 14-foot-high seated golden statue was in the middle of it. It was the Albert Memorial, built to honor the memory of Queen Victoria's husband. It says around the base, Queen Victoria and her people to the memory of Albert, Prince Consort, as a tribute of their gratitude for a life devoted to the public good. So as I circled it, I saw there was a group of statues on every side, and as I looked at each one and read the placards, I saw that it was a depiction of all four corners of the earth bringing tribute to Albert. That seemed confident. This is not just a grieving widow or a grateful nation paying tribute, but the whole world is gathering to honor Albert. Well, the egotism and the colonialism that are built into this memorial are so over the top that it's hard not to be kind of repelled by it. But in person, it's also a kind of stunner. It just sucks you in. It shows you really everything you need to know about how the British conceived of themselves and impressed themselves upon the world. Outside of London, across England, architects continued to envision and carry out projects of massive scope. But rather than being cathedrals or palaces, they are public works. Here is the Clifton Suspension Bridge, just one such example which still remains and still is in use today. It was built from 1831 to 1864, and it spans 702 feet, and it had to be higher than the tall-masted warships that were going down the River Avon to the ocean. Like many public works, it required multiple rounds of funding and planning, and as you look at it now, you wonder how they had the faith to believe such an immense structure could be built. It's one of the monuments of that period. Now, one of the links in this week's folder is to the Tower Bridge of London. You can watch London's transformation in time. It's really beautiful. And there's just a glimpse of the bascule chamber, which is a huge lever to lift and lower the Tower Bridge of London. Now, the first time I saw this, my jaw just dropped. It's such a big piece of machinery, so beautifully and precisely designed. It just shouts, the engineers really believed in themselves. And again, they were right. It still works. The engineer who's most famously associated with Victorian projects is Isambard Kingdom Brunel, here pictured next to the ship the Great Eastern, launched in 1858. It was a passenger ship, the largest of its kind, and it could carry 4,000 people. It took 3 tries to launch it. It didn't go the first 2 times, and it was just too big for many of the ports in the world. It was never a paying concern. However, in its later career, it was the first ship to lay cable across the Atlantic. It was an unfortunate ship by many accounts, but it was the product of an era that wasn't afraid to go big. In the Enlightenment, while air pumps were being built and early chemical experiments were going on, the political questions were, how shall we live together in governance, and how shall we defend and define basic rights? And the scientific thinking of that period mirrored in some ways the political efforts. What are the rules for these basic elements? The Fellows of the Royal Society and many others across Europe were exploring and continuing to build on the past. Gravity, light, electricity, chemical elements of water and air, calculus for motion over time, and, as we saw, the organization of living things, plants or other things, into parts and families and kingdoms. And that's part of the story of Darwin. The beginning of that is to say, how does everything relate together? This is the age of classification. And there is also some kind of racism and sexism that is involved in classification. you can see that Linnaeus really organized his flowers according to what he called their sexual parts, and he organized them according to what human sexual parts could be or should be. It's a curious way of seeing the world. It's definitely the way he saw the world, and it's the way classification was built. And in this century, the field which really becomes a separate field in the Victorian period is biology, and particularly anthropology. Let's turn to Charles Darwin. Darwin grew up in a financially comfortable household. His grandfathers were Josiah Wedgwood and Erasmus Darwin, and they both had a fortune to leave to their children. His father was a doctor, and he lost his mother at the age of 8, so he was raised by 3 older sisters. Darwin was sent to Edinburgh at 16 to study medicine, which he really disliked, and then he was sent to Cambridge at 19 to become a clergyman, which was kind of the ordinary way to become a naturalist. There he eagerly took up geology, but he realized he just couldn't answer for his conviction or his calling to be a clergyman. He didn't think he really believed. So he was offered a spot in the HMS Beagle, and after a wrangle with his father and gaining the support of his uncle, he was then allowed to go. He left at the age of 22, and he spent 5 years on the voyage from 1831 to 1836. The voyage brought him to South America, to the Andes, to the Galapagos, to Australia before arriving home. He really enjoyed it. He spent 3 happy years exploring South American geology and fossils. It was a great trip for him. Throughout the voyage, Darwin's attention was focused on the question, where are species located? Is there change from locale to locale? He also asked, what do fossils show about the change in species, and what evidence is there in rock formations for long periods in geology? He took copious notes and collected skins and bones and fossils and other specimens, as people did in those days. And by the end of the voyage, he had begun to formulate his great idea of evolution. So there was family money, and Darwin himself invested successfully in railroad stocks. So he didn't really need to work as such. He retired to what was called Down House, a country estate about 15 miles south of London, and he wrote. He married his cousin, Emma Wedgwood, and they had 10 children. They lost 2 in infancy and his daughter Annie at the age of 10 in 1851, but that's in the future. Right now, for about 10 years, from 1836 to 1846, Darwin just wrote and wrote and wrote and wrote. He wrote about all the observations he had made in his great voyage, and you can see here that there are a number of books that come out of that. There is the Zoology of the Voyage of the HMS Beagle, which was 2 parts of a 5-part series. There was a separate journal and remarks, The Voyage of the Beagle. Then, again from his observations, the structure and distribution of coral reefs. Then, geological observation on the volcanic islands visited during the voyage of the HMS Beagle. And last but not least, geological observations on South America. He then moved on to something you might not guess. He then moved on to barnacles and published 4 books across 5 years, taking us up to 1854. Now Darwin knew that he intended to publish on evolution and natural selection, the basic ideas of which he had formed on his voyage, and which he had sketched out as early as 1837. But he hesitated. He was fearing the public reaction. But in 1858, when another scientist, Alfred Wallace, sent him a copy of ideas that he was going to publish, which were very similar to his own, Darwin worked to arrange a joint reading of their ideas before the Linnaean Society. Darwin was going to go, but his youngest, his baby son, died 2 days before the reading, and so he didn't attend. However, Darwin was at last spurred to get his ideas in print because he had competition. So in 1859, The Origin of Species was published, and it sold out promptly. We really can't overemphasize how important this idea is, or that it is formulated in its most memorable way by Darwin. And the idea is very simple: survival of the fittest. Things that are best adapted to their environment survive and get their genes into the next generation. These slight advantages over time bring big changes in species. So, catastrophe in the environment or genetic accidents brings out these best adapted qualities in any living organism. And it's true that others had said something like this idea, but no one had brought his level of data and observation to the question of speciation. Darwin had avoided any direct claims about the descent of humankind, and in fact he worked on several other books on orchids and plants. But by 1871, he was ready to publish his other essential work, The Descent of Man. And in this, he tackled the idea that humans, too, were evolved from primitive and simpler life forms. There is a wonderful apocryphal quote that we can enjoy about this book. The bishop's wife said, "My dear, let us hope it is not true. But if it is true, let us hope it will not become generally known." It's a wonderful play on how the British might have reacted to this idea of evolution. Well, Darwin continued publishing, including a book in 1872 that had a kind of proto-biopsychology, the expressions and the emotions in man and animals. And in it, he examined a core set of emotions: anger, fear, surprise, disgust, happiness, and sadness. His last book was on the way worms help to create soil. Darwin feared that he would be hammered and rejected in public, and that did in fact happen. He was the subject of numerous caricatures and vilified most unnecessarily. Despite his heroic output of books, Darwin was frequently ill with nervous dyspeptic digestion. Basically, his stomach was upset all the time. He stayed in touch with scientists and friends his whole life, but he really loathed public debates, and he generally let others carry out those kinds of engagements. And when he died in 1882, he was buried in Westminster Cathedral as the highest honor that the nation could give him. Darwin's scientific challenges were significant. There weren't, at the time, very many fossils to demonstrate his ideas about human descent, and also at the time he wrote, the notion of the age of the Earth was still being debated. These questions have answers now, and they have largely borne him out. I would also note that the theory he formed, while it stands outside of his time, it also bears the character of his time, a time of great energy, of dominance, of competition, with the idea that there will be natural winners and natural losers in a world of scarce resources and unexpected change. And the idea that we share needs, feelings, and drives with other beings on the planet seems quite right, seems demonstrably true. And as I said in our last lecture, I think dogs can feel, elephants can suffer, chimps can think, crows can plan, and dolphins can communicate. But there is one other challenge. I think we are alone on the planet if we consider our capacity to wonder, and especially to ask about what happens to us after death. I think I've got an eternal soul, and it is my soul, not my mind or my instincts, that responds to poetry, to beauty, and the thought of death. Who and what we are have important biological answers, but I would say that biologists are not the only ones who should or could answer who and what we are. I've selected 7 images to capture some of the points that our author Patricia Farrer makes about progress and really the triumph of science in Chapter 5. She gives us the 7 typical words: progress, globalization, objectivity, God, evolution, power, and time. And I've chosen this image to kind of capture it all because this is either I would pick the Great Eastern or this picture, which is a painting I love by Claude Monet, and it's called the Gare Saint-Lazare, or the interior view of the Auteuil line. It's in 1877. It's a train station, and it's a serene and lovely and still in some ways dynamic vision of a train coming into the station, puffing the smoke out and obscuring the buildings behind it. Let's look at progress, and Patricia Farrer has this image in the book. It's a cartoon depicting all of the crazy innovations of the age or some of the ages to come. There's a tunnel that goes all the way across the channel to India. There's a Buddha on the church steeple. There's a rocking horse, which is a true future train. There are convicts flying in a bat, presumably to Australia. There's an army held up by balloons. It's fun, it's silly, it's a little strange. This is the idea of progress, and people were kind of questioning it at that time. Have we really gotten anywhere with all these inventions? What is it like to live in our time? Are we going toward a great future? Are we going to a crazy future? What is our future going to look like? This cartoon captures those worries and those questions. Then there's this. This is a depiction made by Alexander Humboldt. He is famous for botanical geography, kind of biogeography. He traveled in the Americas at the turn of the 19th century, and he published 21 volumes from his journey. His work is, I would say, astonishingly ahead of its time. This is a 3 foot by 2 foot, and I'm quoting here from an article, 3 foot by 2 foot Naturgemälde, which depicts Chimborazo, which is a volcano in Ecuador that he climbed. He put it in cross-section, and he showed the plants distributed according to their altitudes. To the right and the left of the mountain, he placed several columns that provided related details and information, ranging from temperature, gravity, and humidity to even the blueness of the sky. Again, all related to the height of the mountain. So this is a kind of variety and simplicity of information that's just unprecedented. And he showed in this very simple way the relationship between elevation and the distribution of plants. So he created all of these infographics throughout his life. Sorry, I put the squirrel in the turns. I forgot about that. All right, here goes. Here's the next illustration example of objectivity. And this comes from Florence Nightingale. These are the coxcomb graphs. This is showing soldiers' deaths from disease. The blue areas show the increasing number of deaths from disease. The blacks are areas of deaths from wounds in battle, and the red are just wounds. So this is the first time someone argued for the public and for politicians with numbers why policy ought to change, because the largest number of deaths came from disease rather than from battle. Nightingale was called and was felt to be an angel of mercy in the Crimea, but she was a crotchety pain in the anatomy to the English Parliament and to any army officer or politician who failed to get the supplies that were needed or the changes made that she recommended. And she went right on being a pain after the war was over. I really like Florence Nightingale. She used math and she used numbers to make her points about medicine. So how about God? For this image, I've chosen the question about how old is the planet and what scale shall we use to measure the history of life itself. And this was a fight that was unfolding as paradigms were changing about evolution. When was the Earth formed? Who formed it? How old is it now? And can fossils or rock strata tell us? So it was in the 19th century that explorers and thinkers first laid down what you see there on the right, the great stages of prehistory. And I think that's kind of a marvelous story that no one had told before this time. I guess I should give you a trigger warning on this because this is kind of a nasty image. I will say that Victorian moralists were grappling with two simultaneous problems. What gave them the right to dominate others, as they were most assuredly trying to do? And what gave them the evidence that anyone is different or better than any beast? The most cynical among them decided that they were not better than beasts, that civilization is a kind of thin veneer, and that might makes right. The Victorians wanted to use biology to define the types of men and put them into hierarchies of capability in order to justify colonialism. The 1860s to the 1930s is the period in which science went along with that political agenda. Here you see an image on the right from Punch, the Victorian satire magazine that captures the question through a cartoon which makes, as I said, a really nasty racist allusion to the popular images that supported the fight against slavery. It sums up the popular bewilderment about Darwin, and it forefronts the question, who has rights and why? We're going to move to America for a moment to talk about the Philadelphia Centennial Expedition of 1876. This really kind of brings in the image of power in a new way. And I'm quoting mostly from the website, the Hagley website, about this centennial. Hagley is a museum in Pennsylvania, not too far from here. All right, so the Philadelphia Centennial Exposition was celebrating the 100th anniversary of the American independence, and the centennial announced the ascendancy of the United States of America as the leading industrial power. Not quite true yet, but it was getting there. So on May 10th, 1876, Ulysses S. Grant and the Emperor Dom Pedro II from Brazil each pulled a lever which started the massive Corliss engine, which I'm showing you here, which was in the machinery hall. And the Corliss engine powered a myriad of other machines by a sophisticated networking of metal shafts and belts. So it powered everything. Countless wheels, shafts, and power bands flew into motion as hundreds of machines throughout the Great Hall engaged in their respective operations. So Corliss, presumably for the publicity of the thing, donated this machine. And again, I'm quoting, "The completed engine weighed 700 tons and was shipped to Philadelphia in 65 railroad cars. The massive engine stood over 40 feet high in the center of 14 acres of exhibits and machinery hall. It was on a platform that was 56 feet across. The two cylinders spun a flywheel that was 30 feet in diameter and weighed 56 tons to produce 1,400 horsepower." So what did it power? It powered things that were combing wool, spinning cotton, printing newspapers and wallpaper, sewing cloth, making shoes, sawing logs, and pumping water. This is yet another moment in the connection between science and technology, and a moment where science is sort of seen to triumph through the power of this machine. Here's something that affects us today. I really love this complicated little chart. It was meant to help you know what time it was when you were in, say, Philadelphia or Boston. So take a look at the left there, Philadelphia. At noon in Philly, it was 12:04 in New York. It was 11:10 in Chicago. It was 11:28 in Columbus, Ohio. And so if you look around the outer dial and you keep yourself at noon in Philadelphia, you can tell what time it is. Why did you need that? Well, when you traveled by train, you had to know what time it was locally in each city, so you didn't miss your next train in New York by being on Philly time when you arrived in New York. Holy smokes, right? No wonder the railroads really pushed for much bigger time zones than cities. And eventually the whole world got itself organized in time zones. If you look at the clock or you look at your watch, you owe what time it is right now to the 19th century railroad. And then among the more interesting items we want to pause to note before we end this lecture is the work on electricity. The Fellows of the Royal Society and many others across Europe were exploring and continuing to build on the past, the chemical elements of water and air, calculus for motion over time and gravity, light, electricity, specifically electricity. On the left is an image of the early experimenters with Leyden jars. The jar, which is lined with metal and is holding water, collects static from a swiftly turning glass ball on the right. The picture shows not just a guy in a neatly tailored 18th century coat and tie wig, pointing at nothing, but actually the moment before the neatly tailored assistant, who is a loyal assistant, receives a shock big enough to knock him onto his anatomy. He's about to touch the string going into the water. What Franklin and others discovered was that static electricity can pack a heck of a wallop, and they all wanted to know, what is this stuff? Is it a fluid or what? So it was Franklin who described and set up a series of Leyden jars and called it a battery. Now Michael Faraday, who was born in 1791 and died in 1867, so across the period we're discussing, was a man with working class roots. He educated himself through an apprenticeship with a bookseller. He just basically read the entire time that he worked for that man. And then he went to London and he boldly asked for a job with the Royal Society and was turned down. But by perseverance and dogged hard work over a year, and he kept at it, and he finally got the job. He is credited with major discoveries in the understanding of electricity, including the key principles behind electromagnetic induction, which is what we use today for transformers and generators. He was a sharp experimenter, a good lecturer, and a very humble guy. He turned down awards, honors, and leadership posts left, right, and center. And here we have not a picture of anything electric, but a sweet letter to his fiancée, which regularly gets included in great love letter anthologies. I'll give you a moment to read it. This is an image of what electricity means to the whole world. Economic development, the internet, the cloud of data, connection, education, health, and travel. And this is where we will be next week and in the following weeks, looking again at atoms, science labs, and the continued fight for the inclusion of everyone in the sciences.